Hey Soma, it is so good to be with you guys. Coming at you with a little bit of a different format on a Tuesday night. So it's not me in a Zoom. I'm obviously here with one of our amazing leaders, Jacob, and so we kind of just are gonna do a little bit different for Somas. And so happy December 1st, happy Somas. There's still going to be life groups that are happening after. You'll be able to find all of those links in the chat afterwards. I'm going to be in the chat interacting with you guys, so it's gonna be fantastic. I'm looking forward to it. But why don't we get into the meat and bread of what we're doing tonight? So if you have your Bibles, would you open up with me? I'm also going to make sure that it is on the screen for you guys. Luke chapter 1. We're starting our Advent series, and so no better place to start than in the book of Luke, starting in chapter 1 in verse 5. And let me read this to you guys. When Herod was king of Judea, there was a Jewish priest named Zachariah. He was a member of the priestly order from Abijah, and his wife Elizabeth was also from the priestly line of Aaron. Zachariah and Elizabeth were righteous in God's eyes, careful to obey all of the Lord's commandments and regulations. They had no children because Elizabeth was unable to conceive, and they were both very old. One day, Zachariah was serving God in the temple, for his order was on duty that week. As the custom of the priest said, he was chosen by lots to enter the sanctuary of the Lord and burn incense. While the incense was being burned, a great crowd stood outside praying. While Zachariah was in the sanctuary, an angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing to the right of the incense altar. Zachariah was shaken and overwhelmed with fear. When he saw him, the angel said, "Don't be afraid, Zachariah. God has heard your prayer. Your wife Elizabeth will give you a son, and you are to name him John. You will have great joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth. He will be great in the eyes of the Lord. He must never touch wine or any other alcoholic drinks. He will be filled with the Holy Spirit even before his birth, and he will turn many Israelites to the Lord their God. He will be a man with the spirit and power of Elijah. He will prepare the people for the coming of the Lord. He will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, and he will cause those who are rebellious to accept the wisdom of the godly." Zachariah said to an angel, How can I be sure this will happen? I'm an old man, and my wife is also well along in the years." The angel of the Lord said, "I am Gabriel, and I'm standing in the very presence of God. It was he who sent me to bring you this good news. But now, since you don't believe what I say, you will be silent and unable to speak until the child is born. For my words will be certainly be fulfilled at the proper time." Meanwhile, the people were waiting for Zachariah to come out of the sanctuary, wondering why it was taking so long. When he finally did come out, he couldn't speak to them. They'd realized from his gestures and his silence that he must have seen a vision in the sanctuary. When Zachariah's week of serving in the temple was over, he returned home. Soon afterwards, his wife Elizabeth became pregnant, and she went into seclusion for 5 months. "How kind the Lord is," she explained. "He's taken away my disgrace of having no children."
And when it was time for Elizabeth's baby to be born, she gave birth to a son. And when her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had been very merciful to her, everyone rejoiced with her. When the baby was 8 days old, they all came for the circumcision ceremony. They wanted to name him Zechariah, after his father, but Elizabeth said, "No, his name is John." "What?" they exclaimed. "There's no one in all your family by that name." So they used gestures to ask the baby's father what he wanted to name him. He motioned for a writing tablet, and to everyone's surprise, he wrote, "His name is John." Instantly, Zechariah could speak again, and he began praising God.
Well, Soma, that was a huge chunk of scripture, so I hope you guys followed along on screen. We did our best to keep it up there for you guys. Now, there's a couple things that we kind of want to have a conversation about. Everything that's happening leading up to the Christmas season, and so I think it's just so applicable to have Jacob with us and some of the things in his life that he's going to teach us from his experience. And I think there's really no better way to learn than through experience. So I think what's important is that we see in verse 8 where it says, "One day Zachariah was serving in the temple of God." Now, Jacob, tell me about how serving has been important to your life, because we see that Zachariah dedicated his life to serving, and he was just found in what he was doing in the everyday. And I feel like I say that often, where just in doing what you know how to do, God's going to be faithful. But Jacob, how has serving in your life been important?
Serving's been super important. So serving was the way that I first got connected with church. It was probably the way that I met most of the people that I became friends with, people that that really helped me in my faith. It was basically the way that I got integrated with the church community. And for me, it was how I developed a group of friends that were actually trying to be like Jesus, that were trying to know God, that were trying to do things for God, that were taking time out of their weeks, not just on, well, for us it was a Wednesday, but not just on a Tuesday night, to be like Christ, to learn about God. For me, serving was a way for me to get connected with people that wanted to be like Christ, and B, it was a way for me to learn the gifts that I had to offer the church. So like, I didn't know that I liked to play keys. I didn't know that I liked to be leading worship or anything like that before I started going to church. It was nothing that was on my radar. I hadn't even thought about doing anything in ministry, but serving, I was given opportunities to do things like that, opportunities to preach, opportunities to play on a worship team. And that's kind of how I realized that like that was something that was important to me. And so I discovered my gifts through serving, and then I also got to grow them while serving. I got to practice them, learn about new things. I got to develop the things that I didn't know I was even into, but became basically staples and huge important parts of my life. Yeah.
No, I think that's awesome. I mean, I just love the things that you said where it's like, you not only made friends, you not only found things that like you were passionate about and interested about. Like, I think if, you know, anybody was to meet you now, it's like they probably would have thought like you've only done music for your entire life. Mm-hmm. And it's like things that you're passionate about. But that all came about just from being in the church?
Yeah, basically. Like, I liked music and stuff before, but like before that, like I did music and I hated it. Like, I played music and I hated it. I just liked listening to it. And then actually using it as something that I wanted to do with my life was completely born out of being a part of the church.
Man, that's so awesome. Now, moving on a little bit forward, we read this part in verse 18 where Zechariah is talking to the angel Gabriel, and he says, "How can I be sure this will happen? I'm an old man, and my wife is also along in years." And I think he's specifically referring to, like, you know, the idea of them getting pregnant. Obviously, we can extrapolate that having a child was a desire of his, a desire of hers.
Yeah.
We see at the end, she's like, you know, God has rescued me almost like from shame in this moment. But there's this crisis moment in Zechariah where he's like talking to like an angel, which was like pretty crazy. Yeah. And he's questioning the faithfulness of God. Has there ever been like moments in your life where you've just like questioned like the faithfulness of God? Maybe not like talking to an angel, but like, has there been moments like that? Like, what's that been like? Yeah,
for sure. For me, it's like, it's kind of like Zechariah. Like, he became silent because he didn't believe and because he made his own bad decisions. For me, the times that like I questioned God's faithfulness was when I made bad decisions and I put myself in a situation where I just thought like, okay, God doesn't care about this. Like, this is my issue. For me, that took place in like a relationship I was in once. It kind of brought me into this area where I was like super isolated and like detached from all my friends and from everything that I was actually passionate about, just because I was trying to focus on surviving, essentially. And what happened was, like, I just didn't believe that God was going to do anything about that because it was a situation that I'd put myself into. I was like, okay, I have to get myself out of it because I got myself here. It's my mistake. I got to clean it up. And that's just not what God's like. It's just way too like revelatory of like how good He is to us.
That's so good.
Because we put ourselves in like awful situations and we're dumb.
Right.
And then He's like, no, I actually want to help you out.
Right.
And so He was faithful, but for so long I just didn't believe it.
Man, that's so true. Like, have you guys ever felt like you just like you lead yourself into a decision, or you make a bad choice, or you do something that's kind of like foolish, and you don't want to go to God because you almost feel a sense of shame? And like, how big of a lie is that? The idea that God's not interested in your mistakes. Friends, I think like we've all been there, and I mean, Jacob's been there, I've been there in moments where I've just questioned the faithfulness of God. But I love what he said, where it's like God is interested in what is happening in your life and whether you got yourself into that situation. And the idea of isolating, like, how prevalent is that in today's culture? Like, the idea of isolation, I mean, like, there's just been so many moments like that I feel isolated because of COVID. Like, it's just, it's so real and it's wild. Tell me a little bit more about your situation where you just were, struggling to trust God. Like, what did that look like, and what was kind of like a turning point out of that?
For me, it was kind of like, like I said, I was so convinced that like, God didn't care. I was so convinced that like it was something that was all me. And I remember this one time I was at school, I was at Bible college, and I was chatting with some guys that I looked up to, but people that I wasn't super close with. And I just started to think, okay, maybe I should be open. Maybe I should open up to the fact that I'm like struggling, that I'm having a hard time. And so I remember just having like the most baseline conversation, like the most surface level of like, I'm having a bit of a time. And I just said like, hey, what do you think God thinks about this? Like, and that just opened up the door to so many conversations. I started to have like people walk up to me, completely like unrelated, but people in that sphere of school and of Bible college started to walk up to me and have conversations with me, pull information out of me, ask me genuinely like how I was doing. And just like slowly, like God kept introducing people into my life that would push me out of isolation, like forcibly. And that's how I kind of realized, okay, God is actually being kind. Like God's taking this opportunity where I feel isolated and where I've put myself in a situation where I'm separated from the community that I had built. And he's creating a new one that can offer me new kinds of support and wisdom in this situation. And so that was sort of the turning point. Like, it wasn't like one big, like, God did something huge. It was like God kept putting people in my life until I clued in that he cared and he was helping me out.
That's awesome. No, that's so good. What would you want to say to the student that would feel how you felt, where just that notion of God doesn't care?
Well, I'd just say simply like, you're wrong. Like,
Yeah.
there are so many of the things that we get into are our own fault. And so if God didn't care about our mistakes, then he wouldn't care about anything.
Right.
Like, the biggest reason that we're not, that we get separated from God is our own mistakes.
Right.
And so, like, God takes all of our mistakes and take them as opportunities to teach us how much he loves us and how much he wants to be with us. And you see that so many times through the Bible. You see that so many times in the stories of, like, even just Zechariah, who takes he says, like, I don't believe you. And he, like, responds with unbelief. And that's his mistake, and God responds by giving him a child still. He doesn't pull back on that. And so, like, if God's made promises to you in the past, like, he's not going to retract that just because you make mistakes.
Right.
He's still going to follow through.
Yeah, that's so good. I mean, if it was up to me, like, God wouldn't be faithful because I didn't believe it, but it's a good thing it's not.
Mm-hmm.
Moving on just a little bit, in verse 20, after he has that conversation with Gabriel where he's like, nah, I don't believe you, bro.
Mm-hmm.
And he kind of just like moves it along. And this is kind of like Gabriel saying this, but now since you didn't believe what I said, you'll be silent and unable to speak until the child is born, for my words will be fulfilled at the proper time. What's an example of a time where you kind of just stayed silent, where you felt God speak to you?
Well, there was this time around my second year of Bible college. I was supposed to do an internship, right? And there were a lot of places that I could have done mine. But the opportunity opened up for me to actually do it at this place in Germany that was pushing for missions-focused and a worship leader. Like, someone who's missions-focused and someone who's a worship leader. And this was like just when I was really starting to push into that kind of stuff. Had no idea how to do it. But I was like, okay, this is a huge way for me to grow in that gift. It's a huge way for me to do something that I'm passionate about. And I've been in like church settings for a long time, and I knew like my church setting, and I wanted something that would give me a new perspective, right? And so this was a huge opportunity for me, but the thing was, there were so many things that were scary about it. It was like, first of all, it was in Germany, so it was in euros, so it was expensive to get there. I would have been gone for at least 2 to 3 months. And I had so many obligations back home. Like, my dad was sick, and my brother was like about to be going away for like army training, and so I actually wouldn't have been able to see him for a long time right afterwards. I'm just kind of trying to soak in as much time with him as I could. And so like there was like so much pressure for me to stay. And so for a couple of weeks, I was just silent about it. Like, I didn't say that the opportunity come up. I was pretty withdrawn from the person who helped me get that opportunity. And then I realized, like, I was being dumb. Like, this was something that was huge. This is something that God had promised. This is something that God had opened the door for that was, like, way out there. And it was, like, nowhere near anything I could have gotten for myself. It was an opportunity that was going to push me in gifts that I was so scared and so complacent in. And so I finally, like, made that snap decision, like, okay, I'm going to go. And God took that as probably one of the most transformative, like, summers of my Christian life.
Man, that's awesome. I think it's so important to, like, realize, like, you know, I think just as, like, we walk through our lives, when God calls us to something, like, and we really feel prompted, sometimes, like, the best course of action isn't to go and tell the world. Like, I know some of you have been called to large things. And if you were to say that now as, like, you know, a 14-year-old, a 15-year-old, a 16-year-old, people would look at you and be like, you're crazy. And I think sometimes it's like, it's just so important, like, even, like, could you imagine if Zachariah walked out of the temple and just, like, started going off, I'm going to get my wife pregnant, like, we're having a child. It'd be like, bro, you're old. Like, what are you talking about? And it's like, it would have been wild. So I also think, like, sometimes being quiet is just, like, the grace of God. Mm-hmm. And then, like, looking at what, like, Elizabeth says in this moment, where towards, like, the end of it in verse 25, she says, how kind the Lord is, she explains. He's taken away my disgrace of having no children. And, you know, that kind of leads us to the next question. It's like, what's an example of God's kindness that you've experienced?
Well, I guess I could tie that back to what I was talking about when we talked about God's faithfulness. Like, coming out of that, like, relationship, I was still stuck in, like, a lot of loneliness. Like, it wasn't like I was, you know, afraid of people, but I had just separated myself from everybody. It was like I was starting fresh. Mm-hmm. And so for me, the biggest thing was, like, I need God's help to be around people. I need God's help to give me words to say, to help me with, like, any anxieties I have about this, like, crowd. Because, and it was just, like, the situation, but, like, I was at a Bible college where everyone knew each other and everyone was friends and everyone had, like, basically lived together for so long. So I was going into, like, a friendship group that existed and was, like, so strong, and I was just, like, an outsider. And so I was, like, the biggest thing for me was, like, how do I get into this? How do I actually go deep with these people? And God introduced me to this guy named Colby. He would end up being my roommate, but he was just, like, this random guy. I met him because he was going to this birthday party that these other people were going to. And as, like, chance would have it, he needed the ride there, and I was driving an empty car.
Perks of having a car.
Perks of having a car. So I offered him a lift, and we, like, got to talking, and we talked somehow in depth, and we ended up being super late to this birthday party because we were just chatting and going so in depth about, like, where we'd been at with our relationships with God and our relationships with, like, friends, and how we both kind of ended up isolating ourselves, and how we just needed some way to, like, really go deep and to feel comfortable in the community we were at. And so we decided that we were going to be roommates going forward because we felt comfortable and we thought, like, we would be each other's anchor. And God had, like, kind of put that relationship, just like forced it on us. Like, he's like, okay, you guys are driving together and you guys are going to be roommates. And it's just, like, all happened in the snap of, like, that one drive. And it was like a 5-minute drive where we, like, talked and became, like, roommates. It was so fast. But God was just, like, so evident through that.
Man, that's so awesome. It's almost like you experience the kindness of God directly through his faithfulness. Mm-hmm. Like, this is what Elizabeth is saying in this moment where she's like, how kind is God that he's faithful?
Exactly.
And it's amazing. Like, if you, like, Soma, if you think about God's faithfulness in your life, and if I think about God's faithfulness in my life, it's just exemplified in how kind he is because he's so faithful. Mm-hmm. Like, he's so faithful, and his kindness just comes through where it's like, wow, God, like, you not only said that, but you actually did that. Like, thanks for being so kind in this way that, like, you just kept your word. And I think that's, like, so amazing, where it's just like, we see this deep moment of gratitude where it's like, God, you're just so kind because you're so faithful. And kind of where this takes us to the landing point in verse 64, instantly Zechariah could speak again, and he began praising God. Jacob, what's the feeling like when God comes through on his promise, like in your life? Like, what was that feeling when, you got that roommate and you started building friendships? Like, what's that feeling like?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's awesome, in a word. The thing with when God fulfills his promise is there's so much more to it than you expect. So, like, years ago, God had made a promise to me that I was going to be doing something in ministry, and I forgot about it, like, completely. And I'd made so many different decisions over the years. And being back in that community, I started to think back on the promises God had made. I started to think back about the things he'd called me for in my life. The reasons I'd actually gone to Summit in the first place, the reasons that I had decided to pursue ministry, I started to go back to those. And what happened was, through the relationships I built and through me integrating myself with that community, I ended up being put onto a position of leadership as like a worship leader of a team at Summit. And now it wasn't like my dream to be like on stage like head honcho kind of guy. It was my dream to take everything that I'd learned and pass it on to someone. And that was something that God had promised, and he like reiterated through all the people that had spoken in my life. Like, the purpose of being a leader is to reproduce yourself, essentially. And so, like, the promise that I felt like I was like being answered or given was the promise of being a worship leader and using that gift. But really, the promise was like accompanied with like a purpose. So when I became a worship leader, the first thing that I realized my role was to train a co-leader.
That's good.
And it just like, it brought on so many opportunities of me going like, okay, now that I'm here, now that the promise is fulfilled, how do I use that to continue pushing towards what God wants and to continue using it for the reason that God gave me? Because if I just take God's promise and just like live it up, and I'm like, okay, sweet, I'm on stage, I'm enjoying myself, I can play music, like, then I'm kind of wasting what God did. But if I'm taking that opportunity to continue like growing God's kingdom and growing God's leaders, like, that to me is taking God's promise and turning it into a purpose.
Right.
And so I got to spend the next year basically pushing as much information and as much like knowledge and wisdom that God had given me over the years about music and about leading worship onto someone else who I knew could use it a lot better than I could and could lead a lot better than I could and would be at that school the year after I was.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I love that. It's kind of like, to keep along with like having a child. It's not only like having a child, but then it's like raising the child, where it's like, having a child doesn't stop at birth. It's kind of like, that's the start line. And just doing that. And it's just like the promises of God are just, they're kind, they're good. And I love what you said. It's always better than what you actually thought it would be. And so, Soma, let me encourage you over these next few weeks of Advent, press into the promises of God in your life groups tonight. Share with your life group leaders, each other, moments of disappointment where you felt alone, moments where you felt isolated, where you felt God wasn't making good on his promise or he's not being faithful. Let us join you in prayer in those dreams. And then let's share some wins, moments where God was faithful in his kindness. He showed up. And, we could echo words like Elizabeth was saying, how kind is God that he'd come and do this. And so right now in the chat, there's going to be Zoom meetings for you guys to jump into, to join life groups. Soma, we love you, and we look forward to some more Somas conversations over the next few weeks.